again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Pet Sustainability Coalition's webinar on our 4-factor framework for sustainable ingredients. My name is Melissa Bauer, and I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Sustainability at the Pet Sustainability Coalition. And I'm so excited that you've joined us today. Before we dive into the content, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping to introduce you to the platform that you're using this afternoon. So first of all, we have a poll showing. It's asking, have you downloaded and read our 4-factor framework? So if you will all take a moment, if you haven't done so, to let us know your answer to that poll. We'll have a couple more polls during the course of today's webinar. You also, at the bottom of your screen, have a chat button. So please be using that if you have any questions or technical issues on the webinar today. We have the PSC team standing by to help you if you have any troubles. And I would encourage you, if you haven't done so, to jump into that chat and introduce yourself and let us know where you're calling in from today. Finally, also at the bottom of your screen, you have a little button that says Q&A, and that is where we will be taking questions on today's webinar. So you can you can ask questions at any time on that Q&A during the presentation today, and then we'll be getting to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. Finally, the last bit of housekeeping is everyone on the call today and everyone who registered for today's webinar will be getting a copy of the slides that we're going over and the recording from the call today. So before I introduce our featured speaker today, let's see how our answers on this poll. So we asked, have you downloaded and read the 4-factor framework for sustainable protein evaluation? We've got 57% of people who said no and 43% who have said yes. So that's so exciting that we have so many people that have read it. But for those of you who don't, I'm so excited to introduce you to this framework and this really important conversation for sourcing sustainable proteins in the pet industry. To lead this conversation, I'm so excited to introduce you to someone many of you may know, which is Caitlin Dudas, PSC's Executive Director. So Caitlin, thanks so much for joining us, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say today.
Oh, all right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Melissa, for the great introduction. It is an honor to be joined by so many of you today. We were excited to see more than 200 people registered for the webinar this morning. And it looks like, about 40% of you or a little bit more than that have read it, which is great, but it's a pretty extensive document. So also really excited to just give people a more personal walkthrough of the document so that you understand the framework and how it might help your company move towards sustainable ingredient selection as well. So I am sharing my screen. Hopefully all of you can see that in front of you. And I want to start out with just an introduction to PSC for those of you who are joining who aren't a member or who haven't interacted with our community before. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2013, and our mission is to advance business through environmental and social practices. Now, this is a vision for a vibrant and collaborative pet industry that really actually provides a positive impact on the communities and the environments where we do business. People from all over the world who are members and non-members join us for our webinar series. This is part of our nonprofit roots, which is that we want to provide education for those eager to learn all over the world, whether you're a member or not, but really encourage you to take a look at our organization and how you can join and be a part of our member community as well. So Melissa introduced me. I am the executive director and a co-founder here at PSC, but we also have some other team members we're going to introduce you to for the first time today, which is an exciting expansion of our team. We're now at 10 people strong here based in Boulder, Colorado. But that's just a small portion of our team. We really represent a movement. We are a movement of retailers, distributors, manufacturers, brands, suppliers, and producers, all coming together to measure, improve, and celebrate our environmental and social impact. When we were founded in 2013, we had just 8 founding member companies, and today we serve almost 200 different companies throughout the supply chain, both here in the US and also in Europe. All right, so to give you some framework for the conversation today, I think knowing a little bit about our organization, why are we having a conversation around sustainable proteins? How does this fit into our mission? I think that, what's essential to know is we have two primary ways that we work as an organization. So the first one is that we help every member company on their sustainability journey. We deliver them a suite of membership benefits that really help to incentivize and support their process to measure and improve their impact. But in 2018, we also expanded that mission. How do we not just serve individual companies, but how do we look at these areas of impact that are too large for a single company to solve on their own? And so that's really our kind of industry big leading work. And we have identified sustainable proteins, sustainable packaging, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion as the three kind of cornerstone initiatives that PSC helps to lead in our industry. So we only have a pretty short time today, and the document, if you've downloaded it, is pretty extensive. So I'm going to spend a majority of today really talking about the 4 factors, what each of them means. But I think an essential part of really understanding and being curious about this topic is to understand the why, right? So why, as an organization, is protein specifically and ingredient sourcing a focus of our work? So I'm going to share a couple of stats with you that help to understand just how big this opportunity is for the pet industry to participate in a better future. The first is that it's been estimated in the United States that about 25 to 30% of all the proteins raised in our country go to feed pets. Now, this is on the low end. So the study really reports between 25 and 36%. I generally say 25% when I'm sharing the statistic, just to be on the conservative side. And for some people, this feels like, whoa, that's a huge footprint. What are we going to do? But to me, that really speaks to the size of the opportunity that we have to think about our role in this marketplace and how do we participate in shifting our agricultural practices to a more sustainable model. The second piece of information I think that is essential, is that not only are we impacting a significant portion of our land through the protein supply, but we also reach more than 3 million Americans. So more than 3 million Americans, and you have to imagine this is them, but we also impact their families, rely on meat farming or manufacturing or the processing of meats for their livelihood. And so this is also an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of millions of Americans. And finally, and this is kind of an interesting piece, but there are areas of sustainability where it's inspiring to take action and we feel good about the efforts that we're making. And then there are areas of sustainability that feel like there's a very strong need for us to take action, that the threat and the risk to humanity is very high. And this is the way I feel about our impact in the agricultural space and overall the climate impact and how agriculture and climate are interrelated as well. So I'm a very optimistic person. I am generally, I have a very positive approach to sustainability and I see things and opportunities, but agriculture is one of those areas that feels really risky to me. If you look at the planetary boundaries, which we have to live within in order to maintain life on this planet, there are lots of experts out there that are suggesting that if we continue in the path that we are today with our agricultural practices, that we are actually not operating within the safe planetary boundaries. And so that means that we're moving our Earth to a place that's inhospitable to human survival. Now, there's social justice components to this as well. If you think about the people that will be impacted first, it tends to be those that are already living in areas where they don't have a strong access to a positive livelihood as well. And so there are social justice implications to this, but overall, internally, as a person leading in this space and as an organization, agriculture is one of those areas where, we have timelines set of, we're losing soils pretty regularly. So if you think about this, right, we've got a big portion of the agricultural practices that are raising meats related to our industry, the opportunity to touch millions of lives in America, and also thinking about the risk to not changing, right? Which is that we're creating a planet that is not such a friendly place to live for us and for others. And so this is really the why behind why is protein an area of focus for us as an organization. So when we started this work, and again, the shift for us happened a little bit around the 2018 timeline. We started to look at sustainability overall in protein sourcing. We were doing some smaller projects, some life cycle analysis, helping brands to understand the climate impacts or the carbon impacts related to all of the ingredients in their portfolio. And what we found is that meat by volume had a really high impact across their different ingredient portfolio. But what we also recognized is that there was a lot of misunderstanding in the industry and not very much unification around how do you really measure the sustainability performance of any ingredient, let alone a protein. And so our work really started to help develop that unified foundation. How do we bring the entire industry together with all of these different stakeholders to create that common definition or a common place to start from so that this industry can begin to take action in the right direction? But first, having a common understanding of what problems we face and how we would define sustainability overall for ingredients. Now, you'll notice we have a strong focus on proteins, but that doesn't mean that proteins are the only ingredient that you could move through this four-factor model. One of the things I really like about the model is that it is effective for other ingredients as well, so not just looking at proteins. Now, the four-factor framework is available on our toolkit. It's completely free to download for anyone to read. It has a great couple of summaries and executive summaries in the front. And then it has also a glossary of certifications in the back that are in alignment with all of those four factors. So there are several pieces within this document that I think can be critical tools for you to take back to your team after you learn a little bit more about the framework overall in today's session. Now, sometimes I find, because I am not a nutritionist, I have a science background, but not a hard science and chemistry background. And so I wouldn't call myself a nutrition specialist by any means. However, one of the great things about this document is that I really feel it's a great starting point for a diversity of audiences. So whether you don't know much about protein sourcing overall, or you're a brand or a manufacturer, maybe you're an ingredient supplier, or you're a formulator, or you're on the marketing side and you're really, building a brand, I think that this is an incredible document to really set that foundation for yourself so that everybody feels educated and aware about some of the primary issues related to sustainability and proteins and other ingredients in our industry. All right, so let's jump in and get started. So the four factors, it's a great place to start. They are environmental impact. And so that means things like deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use. Social impact, and that's thinking about the impact to people all through that supply chain process. That might include safe working conditions, fair labor standards, and freedom from forced labor. Then nutrition. So nutrition is about nutrition composition, bioavailability, digestibility, and as well animal welfare. And this is about protecting the health, preventing pain and distress, and promoting comfort for an animal's natural behavior. And this is those animals that we're relying on to provide nutrition within the pet food and treat formulas that we're developing. So I'm going to take 2 slides for each of those 4 factors and really kind of give you a sense of where we are today. What are some of the challenges that we're facing, and what are some opportunities within our existing supply chains as well? And then we're going to talk about solutions as well. So in this first step, it might feel a little devastating because honestly, the state of where we are today in our ag system and our practices in the industry has a lot of room for improvement. But in the end, we're going to talk about some quick win solutions as well as some long-term solutions, and then thinking about the system and what role do we play in that as well. So I'm going to start first with environmental impact. So on our planet, right, about 50% of all the habitable land is used for agriculture. And of that 50%, about 78% of that, almost 80%, is used for ag, right? So if you think about, as we shift and change these practices, we're having an enormous impact on a significant portion of the overall land space on the planet. Now, approximately 20 to 30% of human-made greenhouse gas emissions come from our ag sector, as well as 70% of our freshwater withdrawals. It's also the ag industry and the transition of land into agricultural land and away from forest land is a primary driver for biodiversity loss and also deforestation. So while there are heavy consequences with the way we use this land today, there's also great opportunity in the way that we shift those land practices because there is so much of our land is occupied by ag. Now, some key solutions, and this again kind of pulls from our appendix in the 4-factor framework, around different certifications you can use that have more traceability and transparency built into the system in order to ensure strong environmental practices. So we know in our evaluation of comparisons, right? How does chicken, for example, compare to beef? Or how does chicken meal compare to chicken breast? So these are, there are differences among different species, and then there are differences in terms of the nutritional availability and environmental impact of ingredients within each animal. And there are differences by the way the animals are raised. So whether or not an animal is pasture raised, for example, has an impact on its overall environmental impact throughout its life as well. So all of these factors weigh out differently about the comparative environmental impact of different protein choices, and would really encourage you to jump into that report and take a look at some of these certifications, as well as some differences in these 3 areas as well. All right, so social impact. So agriculture overall is one of the most dangerous sectors for workers if you measure that by fatalities, injuries, and disease. And I think another reality is that a lot of these things go unreported at all. And so this is just based on what's reported. And then we have to assume that those levels are actually higher because much of it is unreported. So meat packing and processing, and I feel like this has come more into light during COVID as some of these places have shut down, and there's just been more transparency and awareness of processing, what that looks like in our country. But it has 5 to 10 times the national average rate of occupational illness. Now, those injuries can be caused by farm machinery, but there's generally continuous exposure to things like pesticides, agrochemicals, gases, particulate matter, and those things have impacts, right? If you're exposed to them all day long for long shifts, 5 or 7 days a week, those things start to have impact on health. Now, it's estimated that up to 75% of workers that are in kind of concentrated animal feeding units, which is the majority of our agricultural practices today, they experience acute bronchitis, and that's a result of all of this dust and the manure pits that they're exposed to as well. So social impact overall, it's not a great place to work in our country. And I think there's huge opportunity, again, thinking about how many millions of Americans are in this system to improve in this area. However, thinking about the US and how it might compare globally, most of the social injustices that are happening in the ag sector are illegal, right? People have rights to have a health and safe place to work. And so it does give companies leverage to really dive into that supply chain and to take action if occurrences like this are found. So you can see along the bottom some systems that are helpful with either increasing transparency like SEDEX or creating or expecting standards within that supply chain as well. Things like having a code of conduct that outline what is acceptable and is not acceptable for social treatment of people in these workplaces is important. But doing actual site visits and getting boots on the ground can be very different, right? There's much more transparency when you're on the ground and you're actually seeing what those practices are like, if that's business that you want to be working within and that you feel is in alignment with your values. I think also regular auditing, where you have a clear idea of, hey, if someone is not in compliance with our social standards that are outlined in our code of conduct, what is the clear action that we are going to take so that you're not just creating policy, but you actually have a plan for upholding that policy as well. All right, the third area is nutrition. So I want to reiterate, I am not a nutrition expert, and really excitingly in the next phase of this series, we will be inviting experts to join a roundtable and really dig in with lots of more technical questions for our experts. But what I've learned in the last 8 years in the organization and within the pet industry is that there is a strong focus on protein quantity. And so we tend to market to our industry to drive this. So we say things like, oh, your dog is a beast and they need to eat like an animal. And we have an approach where we have really driven this expectation that maximum protein equals maximum nutrition. And I think really getting into the data and understanding what is the best level of protein and what does it mean to have too much protein, right? There are health impacts of too much and there are health impacts of too little. And really evaluating, the expectation to meet the standards for proper nutrition for pets and not swinging in either direction because it may, consumers may think, oh, more protein is good. And so I'm going to buy max protein. And then thinking about protein quantity and how much we're using has a direct impact to the sustainability of what it takes to harvest those ingredients. And so I think, investing as an industry in education and research that really gets to the bottom of that. A whole lot of companies spend a lot of money on proprietary data that they then keep internally to develop their formulations. But what happens is there's less agreement in the industry around what is proper nutrition, what's the amino acid profile or protein quantity and quality, and how do we measure that, right? So things like bioavailability, not just what's the total volume of protein in every serving. And so I think reevaluating this obsession with quantity. And also at some point, not just with the pet industry, but really thinking about our obsession with nutrition. So one of the things I think about in my personal life is I have a very deep love of avocados. Avocados are one of my absolute favorite things. And about 5 years ago, Chipotle came out and said, hey, we're not going to be able to offer guacamole on our menu anymore because avocados are becoming impossible to grow in the state of California. And with changes in supply and demand, and just the inability, they're a highly intensive water crop, for example, they thought that they were going to run out of guacamole. And so there was a bunch of effort to try to take a look at the avocado industry and how could we create a more sustainable system. But eventually we have to think about our, again, we're on a finite planet. Sure, we may love avocados and they sure are good for you, but what are the trade-offs? And how do we start to evaluate, hey, I want all of these things for myself, but at what cost to the planet? And so I think there's a maturation of this conversation around nutrition and are we advancing nutrition within planetary boundaries? And so I think that's a conversation that's going to start happening, particularly in the human side. And as we know, things, trickle down into pet in about 12 to 18 months from that. So I think we'll start to see a shift there. Okay, so what are some solutions? I think thinking about stop the race, right? So reformulate, think about quality over quantity and meeting but not exceeding protein requirements. I think also investing in industry-wide research, and then stop influencing customers to desire maximum protein. In some ways, we have created this beast ourselves by constantly telling consumers that they should eat like humans because they're our family, and that that means maximizing their protein use. So I think we need to rethink some of the ways that we're promoting this consumer habit as well. All right, the last section is animal welfare. Now, about 4 years ago, when we started talking about animal welfare, this industry was very familiar with the conversation around animal welfare in terms of, how do we treat animals in the home or in shelters, for example, or where are we pulling wild animals for, say, the reptile industry and where are they coming from? Or what are the practices of moving live animals from one place to the next, right? So when we talked about animal welfare, that was the conversation that in this industry that was really prevalent. If you think about our consumer base and really the industry as well, we are an industry that's built off of this idea of caring, and it's caring about animals. And that means our animals and our pets, but it also means the animals that go into the food that feed our pets. And so I think we automatically have this acute awareness and responsibility to think about animal welfare in the supply chain and the husbandry practices in our agricultural system that we support when we choose the ingredients to put in our food. So the problem is that modern agriculture routinely treats animals as units of production instead of sentient beings. So we forget that they have feelings and emotions, and that it's our responsibility to care for those things through our process, because our sole focus is what volume of meat product are we getting out the other side. Now, that may be efficient in some ways, but it's short-term efficient because we're not calculating the impact of that practice long-term. And it's also maybe something we're just ethically not okay with, right? So having confinement that's too small, where animals can't turn around and stretch their limbs, or amputation without pain relief, or inhumane slaughter techniques, feeding them food that their bodies can't actually digest, or using growth hormones that make it impossible for them to even walk, or for their joints to support their bodies moving around. These are things that happen in the food system because we're trying on the outside, how we evaluate success is total number of animals sold in the market. And I think we need to reevaluate, what humane practices also should be embedded in this system. This is one of the areas that we've seen some great certifications and programs in some of our prior events. So at Impact Unleashed, our 2-day conference last year, we invited our Global Animal Partnership to speak about their certification. And this space has advanced a lot just in the last couple of years. And so I think you can lean into some of these certifications, but the reality is that there's not always the supply. And so you have to dig deeper. You have to inquire about how animals are treated. And when I get to some of this kind of systemic issues and barriers that we're facing in the industry, I think transparency overall around tracing where our proteins come from and how they were raised is something that this industry struggles with dramatically. There has been some great work done around chicken. So chicken is our #1 protein in the pet industry. It's used in about 80% of formulas, or 80% of the volume produced by the pet food industry. And it's a great area of focus. And there's been some great work, again, done by Global Animal Partnership around chicken breeds, and how to kind of shift those practices and what our opportunities are there as well. All right. So that's the 4 factors, and that's a foundation, right? So that's really just an introduction to those 4 factors and some of the challenges that we face. I see that another poll is coming up here shortly. But I want to reiterate them, right? So we talked about how would you evaluate or measure the impact of an ingredient. You would look at its environmental impact. You would look at its social impact, its nutrition impact, and its animal welfare impact. And interestingly, amongst these 4 things, sometimes there's trade-offs between the 2. So I can give you an example. A lot of times when we think about pasture-raised beef or grass-fed beef, grass-fed beef have access to pasture. It can be good in some ways on the land, and it can be great animal welfare. But sometimes, or most often, those animals live a lot longer, right? They don't have as short of a lifetime, which feels like a win, but that means they're also creating greenhouse gases for longer. And so we see their methane and their carbon impact go up. And so each of these has trade-offs between one or the other. And it really is intended to be able to be kind of customized for every business. So let's say you really, as a brand, want to focus on nutrition, or you want to focus on sustainable environmental impact or sustainable animal welfare. You can really kind of shape your emphasis and how you prioritize these within your company so that it's reflective of your vision and values. All right. So I want that next poll to come up now. So this is the question for you. I'm going to go over some of, what are those quick wins that we can do. But one of the things I wanted to learn from all of the attendees today, first of all, I just want to say, love the chat box, appreciate everyone writing in and corresponding with us. But the poll is really, where would you rank your company in its current sustainable protein performance? Now, I want you to think about this framework specifically, right? So are you evaluating, first of all, is this the first you're learning about it, right? So is it not on your radar? Or are you actively kind of seeking opportunities to learn more about it, maybe evaluating where you are today, right? So doing some general, like, where do our ingredients come from? Some mapping perhaps. Are you actively setting internal goals and executing on a few small projects? Maybe your team has said, hey, we'd like to shift some percentage of our supply chain away from lamb, for example, which has a really high carbon footprint. And we're looking at some lower impact ingredients. Maybe you're, trying a cricket-based treat line or something like that. Or are you at the point where you're setting external goals and reporting on progress to those goals? So would love to see some responses in here, and looks like that those answers are coming in. So the number one response, thank you so much to the 70 or so people who responded in the poll. It looks like the number one response is just getting started, actively learning and evaluating. So this isn't a surprising response to me in any way. I think this is really a new kind of frontier for sustainability in the pet industry, but I think it has expanded dramatically just in the last 2 years. I can say at Pet Food Forum this year, it was one of the number one leading topics, and there were quite a few discussion items, and classes and workshops around this. So I was excited to see it elevate there. But this is really kind of a new frontier for the pet industry overall. So I think the responses today are in alignment with that. I will say I'm excited to hear that 16% of you are setting external goals around your protein sourcing. That's incredible. When we have external goals set, it creates accountability in our system and tells our stakeholders what's important to us and how we're measuring ourselves and really holding ourselves accountable to those goals. So really excited to see some of those numbers. All right, so thanks for sending those in. So I want to go over now this short list. So within the document, if you download the whole thing, I think there's actually about 20 kind of actionable pieces and recommendations in there around how you can move your company into alignment with the 4-factor framework and how you can embed sustainability into your sourcing practices overall. So I'm just going to cover these 5 here, but again, would encourage you to get that whole list by downloading the report. So the first is to know what's in your supply chain. And again, this is kind of in that first, like, just getting started section. So this applies to the majority of you, which is, not to look at all 200 ingredients that you might use, but let's look at those areas that occupy, a big volume, right? So maybe you're looking at your top 10 ingredients and start there. Where are they coming from? How much transparency do you have into where those ingredients start from and every step of the way from farm to bag? So I think that's a great first step. Then identifying your strengths and weaknesses. So I think looking at these 4 factors and wondering, hey, are we sourcing humane on the animal welfare side? Have we asked our suppliers what their environmental impact is? Do we know what the social compliance standards are with many of our suppliers as well? Or if you're, working in the supply side, kind of looking at your practices as well. The third piece here is eliminating protein overuse in formulations. So this is really evaluating what are the dietary requirements, how do we evaluate what is available through our formulations, and then reformulating to meet that standard but not exceed that standard. There are actually several reports out there that talk about the implications to health for overfeeding protein, and I think it has some health implications on the gut and also that waste footprint out the other side as well to consider. Buy certified ingredients where available. So I mentioned that there is that appendix of list of certifications that you can look at. I think this is a great opportunity to really talk to your suppliers, or if you're a supplier, to look at where there might be sources of certified ingredients that do have that traceability and transparency baked into that system as well. And utilize the whole animal. So this is one of a significant piece of looking at a choice you can make that would impact all 4 key categories, right? So if you're utilizing the whole animal, it takes less animals to meet your demand. So that's on the environmental side. All of the production developed, you're really utilizing as much protein from each animal as possible. If you look at the social impacts, again, right, we require, or we we have people who serve this industry. And so being efficient with that process also alleviates the stress on the social side of that system. Humane animal treatment, if you think about animal welfare, the less number of animals that we need overall, we can treat them better in that process, and we consume less of them through the process overall. And then finally, on the nutrition side, really looking at what's the variation in those macro nutritional elements we need, like amino acids, but also things like vitamins and nutrients, and thinking about the whole profile of the animal, and each piece can provide a different level of nutrition, and combining those things together to meet those nutritional and dietary needs as well. Okay, so that was just kind of 5 that are there. There are other ones, again, in the bigger report. Would really encourage you to jump into that whole document. So recognizing we have just a few minutes left today, about 6 minutes, I'm not going to dive too deep into this today because I want to leave some time for a Q&A. But those are, that approach that we just talked about was the 4-factor framework and what every individual company can do to take action. But there's another conversation to be had, right? And that's about systemic problem solving. So as an industry, the access to high-performing sustainable proteins across all 4 factors is low. Demand at the same time is also too low, right? So we don't have a unified voice where we're saying, these are the type of sustainable ingredients that we want as an industry in order to provide the market incentive and the signal for the supply to respond to that. And because it takes money and time and R&D in order to make those changes. And so really unifying our voice behind a clear minimum expectation when it comes to sustainability and what those expectations are. Right now, there's a diversity of asks out there. And when we bring in experts, we're going to talk more about each of these pieces and what their experience and perspective is on all of them as well. So would really encourage you to attend the next 2 sessions, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. So first step, right? So, well, first of all, let me take a step back and say that the Pet Sustainability Coalition is about collaborative solutions, right? So we want to help every member company and every company in the pet industry align themselves with sustainable ingredient sourcing. But we also know that we need to come at this in a collaborative way because it's a systemic problem and you have to have systemic solutions and you need participation to do that. So we're bringing forward collaborative solutions, scientific data, so looking at life cycle analysis across different protein types within animals and amongst different species. Expert partners, right? We have supply chain partners that are helping companies to identify suppliers that meet these, to recognize those incredible suppliers out there who are already actively bringing sustainable ingredients to the forefront. And then we're also leveraging this ambitious community of hundreds of pet companies that are committed to a more sustainable future. So each individual voice and each member company may feel small, but when we combine all of our voices, we have an ability to go much further together. So I would really encourage you first to download the 4-factor framework and share it with your teams, learn more. And again, you can find that in our toolkit for free. Hopefully someone on our team will post that in the chat box so you all have immediate access to it. And we'll send it out in the recording of today's webinar as well. Join PSC. So if you're not a member, a great way to get started is to join us. We have 4 membership levels that you can join on an annual basis. And then you get to work directly with our team of experts so that you're not going at this alone. If you are a member already, then reach out to our member project team. I'm excited to be able to introduce a couple. Well, we're going to introduce John in a minute, and he has expanded that team, and Melissa's on that team as well. But we have a team of people that are eager to help support your next steps. And if you've already done those 2 things, or you just love the work that we're doing, we do accept donations specifically focused on our protein work. And so we're happy to take your investment and turn it into actionable solutions right here in this industry. I'm going to talk about our upcoming events and then open it up to Q&A. So I mentioned this is the first of a 3-part series. First of all, John is asking, since we have a few minutes, while I go over our next events, please enter any of your questions in that chat box. and they will ask them in just a minute. Actually, sorry, there's a Q&A box. Looks like there are 14 questions in there now, which is great. But if you want to enter a question in there, John's going to ask those out loud in just a minute. And while you're entering those questions, 2 upcoming events for you to know about. First of all, this is a series. This was just the introduction to this framework, and I know it's not enough. And we have a panel of experts that are going to join us that are specialists in each of the 4 factors. And then we have a member panel. So these are going to be real pet companies talking about how they're grappling with the 4-factor framework and the successes and challenges they're having in their supply chain. And then the other event that you should know about is our Unpacked conference, which is a 3-day conference all about sustainable packaging coming up February 22nd through 24th. All right. I'm going to go ahead and ask John if you want to turn your video on, and we'll give you a quick intro and then have you ask some questions.
All right.
All right, perfect.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Spearman, and I am the Sustainability Project Manager at PSC and one of the newest members of the team. Just a little bit about me. I have a background in retail. I just worked for Target for a while. I have a background in consulting and environmental sustainability. And I'm very excited to be a part of the team and looking forward to helping everyone here in some future projects and making the pet industry a little bit more sustainable.
Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I know we got a few minutes left here, so I'm going to jump right into a couple questions. First one, does the 25% to 30% include the use of byproducts, or is that 25 to 30% of human quality protein?
Yeah, sure. So that's all of the proteins raised. So that's by volume. So it would include the whole animal, not just the human grade portions of that. And when we send out the presentation today, so you may have noticed on each slide, it has all of the sources from which that data comes from. And then in the 4-factor framework itself, it also has all of those citations listed. So you can jump into that report and take a look at it as well. But that is for total volume, which would include byproduct, co-product, and everything that comes from animals raised in the agricultural system here in the US.
Okay. And a quick follow-up to that, where does PSC stand on byproducts, and would reincorporation of byproducts be more sustainable?
Yeah, sure. So we get asked this question a lot, actually. And one of the first things that I think is important to understand is, why have we shifted away from the use of byproducts? And I think one of the things that is apparent, and one of the systemic problems in our industry, is that byproduct when you choose byproduct, or particularly in meals that are rendered and put together, those exist on a system that, you put meat pieces into it and out comes a meal. And you lose all the traceability and transparency that you might have had with larger pieces or different cuts of the meat. And so I think what has happened is that the response to not using byproducts is really about safety and transparency. So I think, things like recalls, where we have lost safety in that flow of material because it's not traceable and it's not transparent, is part of the reasons that we have shifted over to not using byproduct. And so I think it is critical to understand that element, that if we were able to increase transparency and traceability of byproduct, I think that we could better ensure safety and quality of those things and move further from our current trend, which is to move toward more human grade products in order to address that problem. I think on the nutrition side, there's a lot of data out there that organ meat is highly nutritious for pets. It doesn't mean that everything that comes out of an animal is nutritious for pets, but I think, thinking about whole animal utilization is essential for sustainability. And that means also looking at the nutritional profiles of byproduct and different organ meats and how they can be blended in. Because at the end of the day, ethically, we also have to meet the nutritional needs of all the humans on the planet, which is, predicted to be growing as well. And so I think we need to consider that when we move human grade proteins from humans to pets, the ethical components of that as well.
Thank you. Next question. How do you balance sustainability and animal welfare if free range is sometimes more unsustainable than factory farming, especially when it comes to deforestation and land use?
John, sorry, I was reading some of the comments in the box when you read that question. Can you read
no problem.
the question, please?
How do you balance sustainability and animal welfare if free range is sometimes more unsustainable than factory farming, especially when it comes to deforestation and land use?
Yes, so I would love to see this question asked when we have our expert panel up, and they can talk about some of those trade-offs as well. But again, all of them have trade-offs. So there are times when treating something more humanely means that you decrease efficiency overall of the volume that is created. Now, when we asked this question in our panel for animal welfare, specifically on the chicken side, what they talked about was actually that there's not a big change. So let's say you choose humanely raised chicken instead of a traditional chicken, then because over the lifetime of the chicken, it needs less antibiotics and there's less loss of life in that process, that ultimately they're not actually less efficient in that process. So sometimes I think there's assumed trade-offs, and then sometimes there are actually proven trade-offs. And I don't know that there's a silver bullet answer, right? So there's not very many solutions that don't require some compromise somewhere in the line of all of those four factors. And so I think every company really has to determine and ask themselves that question, right? Are we willing to compromise on humane treatment of animals? Are we willing to compromise on carbon impact? Or do we, look at a decrease? Maybe you combo that, right? So you decrease so that you're not overusing protein in any area, and you have an immediate savings that you can then reinvest in for the proteins that you do use, you're using humanely certified. And so I think there are ways to think about making those calculations from the beginning of these changes that you're making, and investing, in that reduction of protein use into these other areas.
Great. Next, is there a minimum floor for four-factor you're asking producers to meet, and is there a certification?
Great question. So today there is not. We have not developed a standard or a certification. We do have a standard supply chain code of conduct, which is meant to serve as a minimum expectation. Companies can't, there are options as companies, so it's available for download on our toolkit in the supply chain section of the toolkit. You can take a look at it. That can take years for companies to develop on their own, and we have integrated all of these four factors into that code of conduct. So would really encourage you to use that as a tool that can help develop that standard. However, today we do not yet have an effort to unify the voice around developing a standard and a certification along with the four factors, and instead are relying on the existing certifications that are already in alignment with those four factors. However, we do know as an organization that we need more collaborative efforts to, again, send that market signal all the way through the supply chain around the kind of shift in demand for sustainable proteins in this industry. And so I would expect to learn more about our expansion in collaborative efforts and how companies can participate sometime this year.
Awesome. How does or can vegetable protein play a role in pet protein needs?
Also a great question for our nutrition experts on the next round and the next lineup. So I have worked a little bit in this space. Again, I don't think I'm a qualified nutritionist to be able to answer that question. But from what I've learned, there are plants out there that have great amino acid profiles, great protein profiles, and can provide bioavailable proteins. What we also know is that in some areas, it has less protein overall than meat. So it may be less efficient at providing that. So if you're trying to meet 100% of a pet's need for protein through vegetable-based protein, it may be very difficult to do that, right? You need a lot of ingredients to do that. But if you look at things like legumes, for example, right, their protein profile is higher than, say, rice, which has a much lower protein profile. So there are lots of vegetable-based ingredients that have great protein profiles, and the magic of rice and beans coming together. There are some that are co-products that work together very well as well. And so I think there are times when vegetables can be great providers of protein in addition to, or as well as meats.
Okay. Is the usage of insect-based protein growing fast in the US?
Is the demand for insect proteins?
Is the usage of insect-based proteins growing fast in the US?
Yeah, sure. So I do not have an estimate around the total volume of insect protein used in the pet industry overall and how that's changed. I certainly know that there is more use of it, particularly looking at substituting out portions of proteins. So it would be rare to see like an entire food that is just insect protein. Because it's a new protein, oftentimes when we're developing new systems, when we first launch those, there's a higher cost related to them because the infrastructure isn't built to deliver volume. And so I think we're still very early in that process with insect proteins. In all of the life cycle analysis related to insect proteins, it does show incredible decreases in overall environmental impact. So some very exciting pieces on that side. And I would also say even beyond the pet industry, looking at the use of insect protein in particularly aquaculture, so growing fish. And a lot of times we feed fish other fish. And so there's a loss of protein and not great utilization within that system overall. And if we could think about swapping out insect protein in that system, I think it has impacts. For example, we also use a lot of fish in the industry. And so if we looked at insect-fed fish, I think we could increase the sustainability of fish in our industry through that solution as well. But I don't know by volume how it's increased over the last couple of years.
Would you consider rendering facilities a sustainable facility? They would be taking the waste that consumers, slaughterhouses, and manufacturers are creating something useful.
Yeah, sure. So if we say that animal utilization is a key component to sustainability, then absolutely any manufacturer who helps create better utilization of the proteins that we raise and grow in our country can be a part of a sustainable solution. However, it doesn't, to me, our industry tends to say things like, well, we're just using the waste from another industry, so somehow we're not responsible for the impacts of our 25%. Now, I don't agree with that line of thinking. So yes, I think it is essential that we utilize whole animals, and I think the pet industry has a huge opportunity to help be a utilization market for some of those, but I think we need much more traceability, transparency, and quality assurance in that process in order to truly be sustainable in all four factors, because it's not just about environmental impact, it's also about those other pieces. And so there's a component, the environmental component of sustainability is certainly, I would say rendering is certainly a component of the environmental piece.
I'll take a couple more questions here. Are there
great dialogue, everyone? Thanks for these great questions.
Are there meaningful certifications for local sourcing of proteins to avoid freight shipping costs and impact making it unsustainable?
Well, first, let me say that if you do life cycle analysis, which evaluates the total footprint, environmental footprint of a product from the point where it's raised, it includes the food that goes into raising it, where it's raised, the transportation, the retail of it, the manufacturing, shipping, in the bag, at retail, all of the life cycle of a product. Transportation overall is a very small portion of that. So I think it's important to remember that overall local sourcing can be more sustainable, and there's huge impacts on the social side, right? So you're supporting local communities right there where you live, which has benefits of keeping those dollars local, and they impact your local community in an enormous way that is important part of sustainability. But a lot of people overemphasize the environmental impact of local sourcing because transportation overall is a pretty small portion overall of the environmental impact of any specific ingredient. Now, to answer the question around, are there good certifications? I actually have not heard of very many certifications that like a locally sourced certification, for example. My team may have a better answer to that, and please, team, feel free to enter something in the chat box if you know of any. But there are none included in the certification appendix in the report, and I am not familiar with those certifications.
We'll take two more questions here. How were rangelands factored into the calculations? They're thinking particularly about rangeland in the West that is unusable for anything other than ranching.
Oh, so like the 50% of all land being agricultural? I would have to go back into that study. There are hundreds of studies that were quoted in this full research to know exactly how they did that calculation. So I don't have an immediate answer to the methodology that they used to develop the 50% of all of Earth's land are used in the agricultural sector. John, I'm just taking a look at the time. I think we should wrap up Q&A and encourage everybody to send in those questions that you have to us. I can see that our team put in some email addresses if you want to send those over. We're happy to get back to you on them. And also there is a poll up right now. So please let us know on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest. How do you rate this webinar that you saw today? And again, just really encourage you to join us for the other 2 parts of this series, which I think are going to be equally, if not more interesting, to really understand the application of this 4-factor model and to pick the brains of real experts in this space. But I was so happy to be able to present to you today and to share more about our work here at PSC. This is a personal inspiration of mine to focus on proteins because I really feel this is one of our industry's biggest area to have an impact on the future for pets, people, and planet. So thank you everyone for your participation today. It was wonderful to connect with all of you, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Please, if you get a moment, take the survey before you leave.
All right, thanks, John, and welcome to the team.
Thank you.